is doing everything possible to reach Ukrainian children, including supporting online education from kindergarten through grade 11. We are also supporting an ongoing digital campaign on explosive ordnance risk education while providing education-related supplies. However, remote learning can only be a temporary solution. Lessons from the pandemic, that's COVID-19 pandemic, show the importance of children learning in a school setting with their peers and teachers. In the broader region, thanks to the European Union's Temporary Protection Directive, governments and municipalities in neighboring countries are enrolling children in national school systems and alternative education pathways. This is helping ensure the continuity of children's learning and supporting their completion of the school year. It is estimated that 3.7 million children in Ukraine and abroad are using online and distance learning options. But enormous obstacles remain, including capacity and resource constraints, language barriers, and unpredictable movements of children and their families. We must make every effort to reach those most at risk of being left behind. For the youngest learners, access to education can be especially challenging. Less than 5% of the refugee preschool age children are estimated to be enrolled in public kindergarten. Children with disabilities need access to inclusive services and assistive technology, as well as targeted programs to cover their specific needs, including rehabilitation. In the last month, we have seen small moments of relief as children and other civilians evacuated from Mariupol and other frontline locations reach relative safety. Humanitarians have reached millions of people in need across the country with health, education, water and essential supplies, as well as information, counseling, and psychosocial support. Yet, we know that the situation for children and their families in conflict-affected areas without access to humanitarian assistance continues to be grim. Children and parents tell us of their living hell, where they were forced to go hungry, drink from muddy puddles, and shelter from constant shelling and bombardments, dodging bombs, bullets, and landmines as they fled. The war in Ukraine has also had a devastating impact on the most vulnerable children globally, as food and fuel prices spike to all-time high. Children already affected by conflict and climate crisis across the world, from Afghanistan to Yemen and the Horn of Africa, are now paying a deadly price for another war far from their doorsteps. The repercussions of the war in Ukraine will continue to ripple across the globe. Excellencies, Ukrainian children have been uprooted from their homes, separated from caregivers, and directly exposed to war. Their schools have been destroyed, and the critical infrastructure essential to their survival and well-being, including hospitals and water and sanitation systems, are being devastated by the fighting. Ukrainian children tell us that they want to reunite with their families, to return to their communities, to go to school and play in their neighborhoods. Children are resilient, but they shouldn't have to be. They have already paid an unconscionably high price in this war. We must do everything possible to help ensure it doesn't also cost them their futures. Once again, as humanitarians, we will do everything we can to continue meeting the needs of children affected by this war, to provide safety, stability, and protection. But this will never be enough. Ultimately, children need an end to this war. Their futures hang in the balance. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Abdi for his briefing. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. And I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm grateful for the briefings by Ms. Joyce Masuya and Mr. Abdi. Their briefings confirm our concern regarding the terrible impact that the conflict in Ukraine is having on the lives of children, hence why my country and France requested this meeting. While a cessation of hostilities is not being reached, the priorities of the international community must be humanitarian assistance, the protection of the civilian population, particularly the most vulnerable groups such as children, and avoiding greater harm to basic infrastructure for their survival. Attacks such as that against a school in the Luhansk region are absolutely unacceptable and reprehensible. Attacking schools is a clear violation of international humanitarian law, to which we must not turn a blind eye. In this context, we are following closely the work of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We regret the fact that this incident in Luhansk is not an isolated case. The use of explosive weapons against schools, near schools, higher education institutions, and the access routes thereto must be avoided at all times. Moreover, armed forces must be sufficiently well trained to avoid affecting the civilian population. Mr. President, the impact of the war on children is simply devastating. As has been indicated by UNICEF, 2/3 of Ukrainian children have been displaced by the conflict, and in the majority of cases, they have had to leave the only home that they've known. This conflict is also affecting the mental health and psychosocial well-being of an entire generation, those who have been displaced and those who stayed behind. The trauma caused by this war does not discriminate, and the constant bombing and the psychological harassment caused by the warnings of imminent attacks will have far-reaching and long-term repercussions. We recognize UNICEF's efforts and those of other institutions to address this mental health crisis, and we believe it's necessary to delineate comprehensive strategies to address this scourge. Moreover, we are concerned at the increase in reports of sexual violence against children, for which support services are extremely limited. Effects on health facilities is also leading to a deterioration of sexual and reproductive health services and neonatal care. The massive wave of displacement has made children and adolescents a target for people trafficking networks, and unaccompanied minors and those separated from their families are particularly vulnerable. We call on host countries and institutions such as the UNODC and Interpol to address these new circumstances and to register and identify refugee minors. Finally, we cannot forget to mention the situation of children with disabilities, whose vulnerability is all the more acute. In addition, Mexico underscores the importance of ensuring that any child from Ukraine or any other country is provided with the same treatment. There cannot be a system with two different levels of standards in the way in which we treat refugees. Mr. President, in closing, any war is a war against children, and this is no exception. That is why we ask the Secretary General and the Special Representative of Children in Armed Conflict to ensure that in the next report on this topic to include Ukraine in order to establish a monitoring and reporting mechanism. They should list those responsible for grave violations against children and address the situation in the working group on children and armed conflict. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mexico for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank Ms. Msuya and Mr. Abdi for their briefings. The Russian aggression continues inexorably. The Russian army is continuing to kill civilians, including children, and to destroy civilian infrastructure. We all know that the number of civilian victims is significantly higher than the figures currently being communicated. The head of the human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine has spoken of thousands of additional dead, including in Mariupol, this black hole that it is so difficult to access. The cost of war on children is terrible. 2/3 of Ukrainian children have been displaced, and the majority of them are out of school. France condemns all attacks on schools, particularly that in Bilohorivka. More than 200 medical facilities have, moreover, been attacked or destroyed, according to the WHO. Attacks on schools and hospitals, as well as the murders and mutilations of children, count amongst the serious violations of international humanitarian law and the rights of children in wartime. We call on the Secretary-General to harness all of the mechanisms established by the Security Council to verify the facts and to establish responsibility. These tools include, in particular, the annual report of the Secretary-General and its infamous list. Those who kill children and attack schools fully belong on this list. These crimes will not go unpunished. France will continue to support investigations to tackle impunity by providing its full support to Ukrainian justice and international courts, including the International Criminal Court. Mr. President, it is urgent to act. We call on Russia to respect the order handed down by the International Court of Justice to bring an end to this unjustifiable and devastating war and to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. The protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is an absolute priority. This is why we reiterate our appeal for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law is non-negotiable. Humanitarian access must be guaranteed. France calls on the parties to cooperate with the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council. France hails the Secretary-General's efforts as well as those of UN agencies and the ICRC that have enabled the evacuation of hundreds of civilians from Mariupol. It is crucial that the evacuations of civilians and all wounded continue while at the same time letting evacuees choose their destination. We applaud also the work of UNICEF and UNESCO to allow displaced children to have access to education, including remotely. Mr. President, the entire world is being affected by this war that every day is increasing the threat of a major food crisis. We once again call on Russia to lift the blockade of Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea in order to allow for the export of foodstuffs. France will continue to step up its efforts to counter the adverse repercussions of this war on the most vulnerable countries, in particular in the context of the Farm Initiative. France and its partners will remain fully mobilized to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. It will also continue to fully contribute with aid standing at around $2 billion. As announced by the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, during the Warsaw Conference on the 5th of May this year. As we have just commemorated the end of the Second World War, we are determined to continue to mobilize for freedom and peace in Ukraine and across the whole of the European continent. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank Ms. Nsuya and Mr. Abdi for the updated information. Colleagues, we meet again on Ukraine. The war is going on with its destructive path. The overall situation is dire and worsening. People continue to suffer. Lives of countless civilians, particularly women and children, are devastated because of this war of aggression that continues unabated. If one would try to summarize the news that we get every day from Ukraine, including what we heard from the briefers today, it would be continued shelling with mounting civilian victims, targeted cities with large-scale destruction of civilian infrastructure, persistent attacks of hospitals, healthcare facilities, and schools, Horrible crimes including extrajudicial killings, torture, rape, and mass graves. Countless shocking personal stories of lives uprooted, ripped apart, which will never be the same again. We also hear about the continued Ukrainian resistance against a continued war they did not want, that they did not choose. As the war goes on and intensifies, so does the magnitude of human suffering. Over 7,000 civilian casualties, 14 million people forced to leave their homes in only 3 months. 2 months ago, the UN projected some 4 million people would be displaced by the war. In less than 10 weeks, that number is now 5.8 million, and the new projection is double, 8.3 million. This requires more financial support for refugees and host countries to face challenges with access to food, housing, transportation, and services. Massive destruction of civilian infrastructure has made life unbearable or completely disrupted for millions of people, because systematic destruction of health facilities, transport, supplies, and warehouses only affects severely basic services. Mr. President, in this background, we are particularly concerned by reports of unlawful attacks on schools which deprives access of civilians to education. It is unbearable to see a school that used to be a school and now it's a pack of rubble. Schools, just like hospitals, should be safe places, immune to harm, free from attacks. In Ukraine today, they aren't. An average of 22 schools a day have regularly been under attack in Ukraine since the start of the war, disrupting the education of those 5.5 million children that are still in the country. Their school year has ended on the 24th of February. At least 1 in 6 UNICEF-supported schools in eastern Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed since the start of the war. Only a few days ago, more than 60 people were feared dead after a Russian bomb flattened a school being used as a shelter in the village of Bilohorivka and at Luhansk region. There is no justification for such recklessness. Against this desolate picture, we are pleased to highlight that on a positive note, UNESCO Global Education Coalition, composed of some 200 members from private sector, civil society, academia, and the UN family, is working to ensure the right to education and to continue the continuation of learning in Ukraine. Digital devices will be provided to Ukrainian teachers, reaching out to hundreds of thousands of learners to ensure continuity of online learning. Also, a higher education e-assessment platform will allow some 200,000 students to pass their examinations. Dear colleagues, as the military aggression escalates, civilian casualties rise, and war crimes and crimes against humanity mount. Reports and preliminary facts gathered on the ground raise serious concerns about grave breaches of international humanitarian law in Ukraine. A report recently published pursuant to the OSCE Moscow mechanism analyzes a shocking range of apparent war crimes, from rape to torture to deportation and the use of human shields. It marks an important step in a long road to a full understanding of the illegal and criminal acts committed and suffered in the ongoing aggression. It concludes that, among other, 2 most blatant attacks mentioned several times during our discussions here: the bombing of the Mariupol Maternity House and Children's Hospital and the bombing of Mariupol Drama Theatre, where several hundred civilians were killed, constitute most likely an egregious violation of international humanitarian law, and those who ordered or executed it committed a crime. Mr. President, everything should be done to secure the rights of children. And in this respect, we call on the SG and the SRSG on children in armed conflicts to add Ukraine as a situation of concern in the SG upcoming 2022 annual report on children in armed conflicts, in light of great violations committed against children in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and 2021, as well as evidence of an alarming increase in grave violations across the country amid the rapid and ongoing escalation of hostilities since late February. thorough investigation must be carried out and accountability must and will be ensured. Dear colleagues, the seismic effects of Russia's war in Ukraine are felt everywhere. The stores in places far from Russia and Ukraine are running out of cooking oil. Farmers are scrambling to buy fertilizers, and governments are struggling to respond to public disquiet due to the sharp rise of prices. Disruptions to the flow of these essential goods are compounding other supply chains, causing shortages and pushing millions of people into hunger. There must be no mistake for who is responsible. Ceasefire arrangements for the evacuation of 600 civilians from the steel plant in Mariupol show that it is possible to find solutions. It is possible to silence the guns in the name of life when there is a will. This should be extended to the soldiers wounded that are still there. We support efforts by USG Griffiths and praise the UN actors on the ground for their contribution and encourage them to continue their efforts. Colleagues, let me end with this. This senseless war must come to an end. The sooner it happens, the better for Ukraine and their people to start healing their profound wounds. The better for Russia and the Russians to get out of a self-victimization attitude. The better for everyone, everywhere. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. There's been a small change to our list of speakers, so I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
I thank you, Mr. President, and the delegations of Mexico and France for convening this meeting. I would like to join previous speakers in thanking Ms. Joyce Misuya and Mr. Omar Abdi for their briefings. Mr. President, after several months of violent conflict in Ukraine and its resultant humanitarian crisis, Ghana is deeply concerned about the lack of satisfactory progress in finding a solution to the situation. It is indeed disheartening to note that innocent children have been caught up in the middle of this armed conflict, and sadly, they will be the most adversely affected by the horrifying situation. As the war continues to affect social institutions, education has undeniably been one of the major casualties, leading to severe disruptions in the education of children. My delegation takes note of a report by the Ukrainian Ministry of Education and Science that 1,397 educational facilities across the country have been damaged and 102 destroyed by bombings and shelling as of 26 April 2022. In fact, the reported attacks on schools and other educational facilities across Ukraine may constitute gross violations of international humanitarian law, particularly against children. On this note, my delegation strongly condemns the bomb explosion of a school building in Luhansk, eastern Ukraine on 7th May, which resulted in significant civilian casualties, and we wish to commiserate with the bereaved families and the people of Ukraine. Ghana reiterates its call on all parties to refrain from attacking civilian infrastructure, especially those whose destruction impacts the lives of children. Mr. President, without the immediate cessation of hostilities, the 7.5 million children in Ukraine would continue to be endangered by the escalating armed conflict. It is very disheartening to see images of students forced to hide in basements and bomb shelters, and children missing months of schooling, which will certainly impact their future negatively. The persisting impunity and high-handedness against children, schools, and educational facilities in Ukraine must not only stop forthwith, but the perpetrators must be held accountable for their actions. In the meantime, Ghana is still hopeful that the war ends soon by peaceful and diplomatic means, so that teachers and students can return to their normal routines. In these difficult circumstances in Ukraine, the fact still remains that war is usually traumatic for children, especially when they are directly affected. The mental impact, especially on these children, is likely to have devastating consequences for several years to come. In this connection, humanitarian efforts should not only focus on the physical needs of the affected children in Ukraine, but also on their psychological needs and emotional assistance, as the damage of the war will result in long-lasting psychological trauma. My delegation reiterates that the mental well-being and safety of the children in Ukraine should be our utmost concern and should remain at the forefront of action of the international community, including this Council. At this juncture, we wish to commend the efforts of UNICEF and its partners in providing education-related supplies and appropriate learning opportunities for Ukrainian children in formal and informal settings. My delegation calls on host and transit countries to ensure that the best interest of children, including learning opportunities, is an essential element of their interventions. We believe that such interventions would minimize the enduring impact that the ongoing crisis will have in the lives of the children in Ukraine and their education. In the spirit of UN Resolution 2601, I would like to reaffirm Ghana's commitment to UN endeavors to protect the children in Ukraine, as well as its efforts aimed at ensuring uninterrupted education for the children. We encourage the continued deployment of the good offices of the Secretary General in the international endeavor to bring an end to the war and facilitate a diplomatic solution to the ongoing security and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. In concluding, for the sake of the lives of the innocent children in Ukraine, we reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to heed the repeated calls of the international community to withdraw all its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and pursue the path of dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank ASG, Madam Joyce Msuya, and Deputy ED, Mr. Omar Abdi, for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Estonia, Poland, and Slovakia. Mr. President, the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine is deeply disturbing. We do not think that it is inevitable that it should continue. But we fear that the Council is settling into a familiar tragic pattern. The military conflict is becoming a protracted affair in which the civilian population continues to suffer gravely. And rather than diplomacy, negotiation, and ceasefire being sought with ambition, far too much energy and attention are being used to make and defend accusations of violations of international humanitarian law. We are forced to restate the obvious, that our responsibility as the Security Council is to protect international peace and security. Of course, our efforts to advance the humanitarian aims in conflict are critically important. But the primary responsibility of the Council remains international peace and security. We must therefore urge the Council and all its members to make every effort to find a path to negotiating peace for Ukraine and its suffering people. A peace that respects and protects Ukraine's rights as a member state of the United Nations. The unfolding political situation in Europe, with alliances rapidly developing that may entrench differences, needs to be stabilized for the sake of international peace and security. If the Security Council and the international community truly embrace the preventive approach, then this is a priority. It is also the best guard against the humanitarian crisis that will emerge as a result of a broadening of the war in the future. President, in regard to the present humanitarian developments, Kenya condemns the recent attacks on civilian objects, including the reported bombing of a school in Luhansk that's believed to have been sheltering about 90 civilians. We again urge all parties to prioritize the protection of schools and other critical civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. We commend the Secretary General for his efforts that resulted in the recent round of evacuations to safety of more than 170 people that were trapped in the Azovstal steel plant and other areas of Mariupol. Mr. President, we must not forget that this war is impacting economies and vulnerable people around the world. The disruption of food and energy supply chain is compounding the food and energy insecurity, especially in fragile contexts, and driving millions deeper into poverty and humanitarian crisis. We therefore appeal for enhanced support for other humanitarian situations, particularly in the Global South. In line with the Secretary General's recommendations on the basis of assessments by his Global Crisis Response Group, states should resist export restrictions and make reserves available to countries with serious food insecurity. We urge states, UN agencies, and international financial institutions to urgently implement the Secretary General's recommendations. Time and boldness are of the essence if this war is not to lead to the escalation of multiple crises worldwide. Mr. President, in closing, we call on the parties to the war in Ukraine and their allies and partners to give more effort to achieving a meaningful cessation of hostilities. In the meantime, we strongly urge Ukraine and the Russian Federation to offer guarantees for safe humanitarian passages for trapped civilians, particularly in eastern Ukraine. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. I thank the briefers for their grave accounts of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Again, Norway condemns in the strongest terms Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. It has created a humanitarian disaster, one which is the responsibility of Russia alone. The civilian suffering must end. The Council's joint expression of support last week to the Secretary General's effort to search for peaceful solutions is a first step towards this end. We need to see a path towards peace. President, the ongoing attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is having a particularly devastating and unacceptable impact on children, their families, and communities. The use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas is destroying homes, schools, and health centers, with children at an especially high risk for lethal and debilitating injuries, 7 times higher than for adults. And we condemn the use of anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions, weapons that will continue to kill and injure long after the conflict ends. The most recent attacks by Russia on schools and the civilians seeking shelter there demonstrate a blatant disrespect for international humanitarian law. These attacks are clearly in contradiction of Security Council Resolution 2601 on the protection of education in conflict, unanimously adopted by this Council just months ago. We call on all parties to protect and respect the civilian character of schools and educational facilities in accordance with international humanitarian law. Continuing education, even during armed conflict, is crucial, including for displaced children. Their right to education must be upheld. President, all Ukrainian children are affected by this war. Many are displaced across borders or internally in Ukraine. We are particularly concerned about the high number of children that are separated from their families. Unaccompanied children are in particularly vulnerable situations and are at risk of human trafficking and sexual violence and abuse. Access to child protective services is key, including child-appropriate mental health and psychosocial support. President, Norway is alarmed about the situation for the many civilians, including children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities who remain trapped in the battle zone. All civilians, including those in care institutions, must have access to humanitarian assistance and safe passage for voluntary evacuation to safety. We're appalled by the reports of involuntary evacuations, deportation, and so-called filtration camps. We're also deeply concerned about the increasing reports of conflict-related sexual violence, including against men and boys. It is of the utmost importance that all survivors are ensured sexual and reproductive health and rights. The atrocities committed during this war must be investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable, and we support the ongoing investigations. And we underline the importance of utilizing expertise on child protection, children's rights, and gender. In ensuring documentation and accountability, it is also important that the right to freedom of expression and free access to information is being vigorously defended. Journalists must be protected. President, I would like to conclude today by commending the humanitarian organizations who are working every day to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of this war, especially local civil society organizations which are doing a tremendous job. But to truly end this humanitarian crisis, the war must stop. Russia chose to invade Ukraine in breach of the UN Charter and international law. Russia must also stop the war and withdraw its troops from Ukraine immediately. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to start by thanking Ms. Masuya and Mr. Abdi for their helpful and informative briefings. Over the past 25 years, the Security Council has repeatedly recognized, condemned, and sought to address the impact of conflict on children. While it will take time for the UN's monitoring and reporting mechanism to establish the full extent of the impact on children of Russia's invasion, there is already evidence that Russia is committing 4 of the Security Council's 6 grave violations against children in times of war, listed in Security Council Resolution 1261. 1. Children have been killed and maimed. OHCHR reporting suggests that at least 238 children have been killed and 347 injured, although the true toll is likely to be far higher. 2. Schools and nurseries have been targeted across Ukraine and, as with the tragic bombing of the Mariupol theatre, children sheltering have been mercilessly targeted. 3. There are credible allegations of sexual violence against children by Russian forces. And, as others have said, mass displacement has left children exposed to human trafficking and sexual exploitation. 4. Reports of forced deportations continue, with over 700,000 people, including many mothers and children, having been moved to Russia. There is now a very real risk of a lost generation and the continuation of a cycle of violence caused by Russia's invasion and the devastation it has created. To address this, we need to work together. First, we urge all countries to endorse and implement the 2016 Safe Schools Declaration, designed to protect education in armed conflict. Second, the international community must ensure that all credible allegations of crimes on the territory of Ukraine are investigated, including grave violations against children, whoever is accused of committing them. We support all efforts to improve our collective understanding of the situation on the ground through evidence and data collection and the work of the monitoring and reporting mechanism. Third, the UK is proud to continue to play a leading role in the humanitarian effort in Ukraine, delivering vital supplies and life-saving medical aid to those most in need, including children. But humanitarian support is not a solution to the suffering of children in Ukraine. Only the withdrawal of Russian troops and an end to Russia's war in Ukraine will end the cause of suffering. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, we thank the briefers of OCHA and UNICEF for their presentations. We also would like to thank France and Mexico for their initiative to discuss the impact of the conflict in Ukraine on children and education. Children in Ukraine, as elsewhere, must be protected from the harm of violence, and under no circumstances should they be subject to violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law. Brazil is deeply concerned with the continued reports of child casualties due to the use of explosive weapons, mining-related incidents, and explosive remnants of war. Both parties to the conflict must avoid the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, including near schools or universities or along routes to or from them. Schools and medical facilities should never be used for military purposes. It is of the utmost importance to implement Resolution 2601 on the protection of education, which Brazil co-sponsored last year. The Safe Schools Declaration, which we have also endorsed, provides important guidelines on this matter as well. In the face of conflict, children and their parents have to endure great challenges. There are reports of Ukrainian parents that, out of desperation, sent their children abroad with strangers. Authorities in neighboring countries have identified children as young as 4 and 5 years old crossing state borders alone or with barely familiar people. For them, family reunification should be pursued with great urgency. We cannot overestimate the impact of war in traumatized children. Furthermore, with the disruption of the school system countrywide, their studies are discontinued and compromised, with lasting impact to their personal development. As the conflict persists, the damage to children's education grows starker. The cessation of attacks against civilian infrastructures is key in protecting children from the harms of conflict. Resolution 2573 provides fundamental guidance for the protection of objects indispensable to survival of civilian population. Children forced to flee their homes to ensure their own survival are especially vulnerable. Brazil is concerned with the alarming number of children who became internally displaced persons and refugees. Support from the international community is needed more than ever, especially to those children who are unaccompanied or separated from their parents and family members. as they are forced into the condition of refugees or IDPs, children can become more vulnerable to crimes, including sexual violence and exploitation. Their physical integrity and well-being should be a priority to all member states. In line with our tradition of solidarity, Brazil has been granting humanitarian visas and residence permits for displaced Ukrainians and stateless persons affected or displaced by the armed conflict in Ukraine. Once in Brazilian territory, they have full access to all public services and social benefits on equal footing with Brazilian nationals. Brazilian civil society has been forthcoming in mobilizing to provide further specialized assistance to help local integration. Other Brazilian humanitarian actions include the donation of water purifiers, food, essential supplies, and medical items. We shall recommit our efforts to end this conflict and prevent the Ukrainians to have lost generations of children, victims of trauma, and without access to proper education. The silence of the guns and the withdrawal of troops may be not enough to end the war, but it would be the first glimmer of hope for the Ukrainians to resume their lives with peace. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, President, and my thanks also to our briefers this morning, Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Deputy Executive Director Abbey. I want to thank you both for all the work done by you and your colleagues to help alleviate the suffering inflicted on the Ukrainian people by the Russian Federation's senseless and illegal war. Thank you again. President, shockingly, 2/3 of all children in Ukraine have had to flee their homes, many leaving behind parents and grandparents, all leaving behind the lives they knew. These children face the horrendous risks of abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. This is unconscionable. We have heard reports of children killed and maimed by indiscriminate attacks. We're also hearing chilling reports of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers, with children reportedly amongst those violated. That is abhorrent. We simply cannot accept such violations of international law causing this suffering and trauma, not in Ukraine, not anywhere in the world. These horrific violations must end, and those responsible will be held to account. President, as civilian infrastructure across Ukraine continues to be demolished by Russian forces, we must respond to the destruction of hundreds of schools, including kindergartens. Attacks on schools, in violation of international law, have profound impacts on the children affected. Let's remember, as in the case of killing, maiming, and sexual violence, attacks on schools and hospitals are listable under the CAC agenda. If this Council is to protect children in armed conflict and to seriously tackle impunity, we must support the integrity and impartiality of listing on these grounds. This Council recognised children's right to education in conflict with the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2601 just a few months ago. Are our memories really that short? Our words should be followed by actions. Collectively, we need to take action to address the disruption of education through the provision of education in emergency settings, psychosocial services, mental health support, and healthcare. It is clear that child protection capacities in Ukraine need to be urgently resourced. Insofar as possible, this Council should support UN monitors and child protection staff. Ireland calls on the Secretary-General and on Special Representative Gamba to consider adding Ukraine as a situation of concern in the upcoming annual reports on children and armed conflict. in order to further assist the extremely important monitoring work carried out by UN staff. Grave violations and abuses have been committed against children in eastern Ukraine since 2014, and now, with the alarming increase in violations since the further Russian invasion 2 months ago, we would fully expect to see this reflected in the next reports. We also call on the Secretary-General and SRSG Gamba to use all tools and mechanisms to address any CAC violations taking place in Ukraine and to deliver on accountability. President, the most innocent of victims, millions of Ukraine's children, are being robbed of their childhoods and of their future by this war. Denying children their right to education has profound impacts on their individual development, but also on the future of Ukrainian society as a whole. We continue to see the devastating impact of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including on schools. Now, and long after the conflict, the contamination of explosive remnants of war will have a disproportionate impact on the children of Ukraine, carrying risks of death or injury, further blighting their futures. Equally, robbing children of the possibility of routine vaccinations exposes them to critical outbreaks of communicable diseases, which can also have long-term debilitating consequences. The evacuations from Mariupol, negotiated by the Secretary-General and the UN, have shown that it is possible to do the right thing for civilians and that the humanitarian notification system can function. We must continue all our efforts to help the people of Ukraine. President, the reverberations of this war, we know, reach far beyond Ukraine's borders. We also know that they will reach beyond this generation. We all have a responsibility to support the people of Ukraine long after this war has ended. At this table, we have repeatedly called for the war to end, for the Russian Federation to withdraw its forces and to engage in true dialogue and diplomacy. However, while armed conflict continues, Russia must comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. We will not tire of making this call. We must meet our responsibilities. The children of Ukraine deserve nothing less from us. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank ASG Masuya and Deputy Executive Director Abdi for their briefings. The conflict in Ukraine is inflicting on children pains foreign to their age. Protecting children from harm is an obligation under the international law that must be fulfilled by the parties to the conflict. China reiterates its call to secure children and the infrastructure on which they depend, and to give priority to children's needs in evacuation and humanitarian relief operations. We welcome the safe evacuation of civilians, including children trapped in the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol under the coordination of the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross, and hope that Russia and Ukraine will continue to increase coordination on humanitarian issues and make every effort to reduce the humanitarian impact of the conflict. The attack on a school in the village of Bilohovka on May 7th resulted in the loss of many lives. Incidents as such are profoundly deplorable. Schools should not be targeted or used for military purposes. The related circumstances and the specific causes should be verified and established. Any accusations should be based on facts. Mr. President, the conflict has been going on for more than 2 months and has uprooted more than half of the Ukrainian children, and millions of children have taken refuge in neighboring countries. China appreciates the safe shelter, humanitarian assistance, and psychological support provided by Ukraine and neighboring countries, as well as OCHA, UNICEF, and other humanitarian agencies for children who seek refuge. China calls on the international community to continue to step up relief efforts to ensure that every child in need can receive effective assistance. The risk of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and abuse faced by children seeking refuge, especially those separated or unaccompanied children, is worrying. China calls on UNICEF, UNHCR, UNODC, OHCHR, and other agencies to strengthen monitoring and support relevant countries in taking measures to prevent and eliminate violations against children. WHO's warnings about disruptions in routine immunization for children and the rising risk of outbreaks of epidemics such as measles should be taken seriously. China supports WHO in cooperating with Ukraine and the countries concerned to ensure that children can receive vaccinations on time. Education gives hope to children in conflict and is also a matter of the future of Ukraine. China supports UNICEF in helping the Ukrainian government to provide educational supplies and learning opportunities for internally displaced children, and encourages host countries to integrate refugee children into their own education systems in order to ensure that children's right to education is not disrupted by the conflict. Mr. President, achieving peace is the best protection for children. Dialogue and negotiation is the most realistic and feasible way to reach a ceasefire and stop the war. The international community should encourage Russia and Ukraine to return to the negotiation track and keep accumulating political conditions for the restoration of peace. China welcomes the presidential statement adopted by the Security Council last week on Ukraine, calling for the peaceful settlement of international disputes and supporting the SG's efforts to promote peace. Sanctions will not bring peace, but will only accelerate the spillover of the crisis, triggering sweeping food, energy, and financial crises across the globe and making children around the world suffer the bitter consequences of sanctions. With children living in conflict situations in Afghanistan, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa, as well as the Sahel region, bearing the brunt of the humanitarian impact, China once again calls on parties to stay rational and exercise restraint, transcend prejudice and strife, and make unremitting efforts for the early resolution of the crisis in Ukraine and for children to enjoy a peaceful future. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd also like to join others in thanking Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Masuya, and Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Omar Abdi, for their valuable briefings. As we heard from today's briefers, the extent of devastation due to the war in Ukraine does not appear to have reached its limits, and its impact is disproportionately affecting children. Well over half of Ukraine's 7.5 million children have been displaced as a result of the conflict, and there are also deeply disturbing reports of hundreds of children having been killed and maimed since the conflict began that should be investigated. War is always deeply traumatizing, particularly for children, and this conflict is no exception, and there is a dire need for essential services such as education and healthcare to be provided urgently and to continue throughout the course of the conflict. We know too well from our own region and beyond the costs of conflict on children and their education, from children in Syria that have been denied an education for more than a decade, to Palestinian children facing continued disruptions to their schooling, to girls in Afghanistan who've been denied secondary education since August 2021, to children in Yemen, Libya, the Horn of Africa, and Sahel, and countless more examples from around the globe. There is a lost generation of children and youth who simply will never regain a meaningful opportunity to learn. The children of Ukraine could face that same fate while this armed conflict continues, and we therefore, like others, urge all diplomatic efforts to end it. And it is crucial that we redouble our commitment to ensure educational access in Ukraine, where the conflict has already significantly disrupted children's access to education. And this comes on top of the COVID-19 pandemic-related disruptions that had already negatively impacted children's lives before the conflict had even begun. As the international community responds to the urgent humanitarian needs in Ukraine, education must be a priority. And it is also critical to ensuring that future generations have the necessary skills to effectively contribute to their communities. So we must think about the period after the conflict as much as the period through it. As UNICEF recalled, children will have a much better chance to recover if they can quickly return to schools and to some form of normalcy in their lives. And so in light of all of these difficult realities, I'd like to focus on the following points. First, we remain deeply concerned by reports of the ongoing damage and destruction of civilian infrastructure, including health and educational facilities. The bombing of the school in Bilhorivka over this past weekend is one disturbing example. And UNICEF has noted that at least 1 in every 6 UNICEF-supported schools in eastern Ukraine has been damaged in the course of the conflict. We underline the importance of protecting educational facilities and ensuring continued access to education. Second, facilitating access to education, particularly for refugee children, is imperative in supporting children's development and maintaining a sense of stability in their lives. We commend the neighboring host countries, as well as UNICEF and UNESCO, for facilitating the continuation of educational services, including through providing equipment that supports online teaching, in addition to expanding digital education platforms. Such efforts are invaluable and must be supported by the international community. Furthermore, distance learning can mitigate some of the disruptive effects of the conflict, and we've noted that 12,600 schools providing education to nearly 4 million students are now operating remotely. Third, providing psychosocial services is critical to ensuring children's well-being during and after the war. Children have been uprooted from their homes and separated from caregivers. Many children have witnessed or experienced violence, included reported sexual violence, and all credible reports should be investigated. We commend UNHCR and UNICEF for their support for the provision of psychosocial services to children, as well as their efforts to particularly help children with disabilities. Finally, we reiterate our call on all parties to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, and we further underline that the protection of children and all civilians can only be assured with the cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine and the reaching of a diplomatic solution to this conflict. This is not only essential for the children of Ukraine, but all children globally living through years of armed conflict. None of these children should be neglected by the Security Council. The reverberating impact of this conflict, including through the rise of food and commodity prices, will fall heaviest on the health and development of children. In this vein, we call on both sides to remain committed, despite the difficulties, to dialogue, and for the international community and this Council to support efforts to end the conflict and establish a process for peace. We are encouraged by the Secretary-General's efforts in this regard and OCHA's feedback to this Council that recent efforts to evacuate hundreds of civilians in Mariupol have shown the goodwill that exists on both sides and are grounds to build upon. We must build on that opportunity and double down our efforts to support these initiatives. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we welcome to the meeting the Deputy Executive Director for Programs of UNICEF, Mr. Omar Abdi, the Deputy Joyce Msuya as well, and we've listened very closely to their briefings. Today, a number of delegations have spoken on subjects other than children and education, which was the subject of today's meeting, but I'm not going to respond to this. I'm going to concentrate on children and education. We think that the subject of today's meeting is more than timely, and that's because the focus of our attention is not just children, but also their education, which is the basis for who they become as people. For more than 8 years in Ukraine, the regime in Kiev has carried out a civil war against its own population. The plans that the authorities and the Maidan had towards children in Donbass became clear after the words of Petro Poroshenko in 2014 about the inhabitants of the Donbass, citizens of the Ukraine, his own citizens. He said, "We will have work, they will not. We support our people, children and pensioners, and they will not. Our children will go to schools and nurseries, but their children will sit in cellars. This is how we will win this war." End of quote. Unlike many other people, Poroshenko kept his promise. The authorities in Kiev have bombarded the people in Donbass and have prevented children from coming out of these cellars. Schools have also been targeted, hospitals, nursery schools, and also key parts of infrastructure. Only our Western colleagues, for political reasons, prefer not to notice this. Over these 8 years, as a result of bombardments by the Ukrainian armed forces, more than 100 children have died in Donbass. In Donbass, there is a tradition of placing flowers in the Alley of the Angels. This is a memorial to children who've died at the hands of Ukrainian military who've taken up arms against their own people. Today, with the aims of education, Ukrainian civil prisoners of war are taken there so that they recognize who, in fact, they were fighting against all of these years. In the period from 2014 to 2022, in Lugansk, in the People's Republic of Lugansk, more than 200 incidents of educational facilities being damaged were established, and more than half of these were schools and kindergartens. This spring in Donbass, once again, children are dying under Ukrainian shells. There's a number of orphans who are also increasing because their parents died under bombardments from the Ukrainian army. Russia is helping the people of Donetsk and Lugansk where it can. According to data, since the beginning of May, more than 190,000 children have come to Russia. Some of them have arrived with their guardians and their legal representatives. And from the boarding schools in DPR and LPR, more than 1,200 children have arrived. We're working closely with the authorities in Lugansk and Donetsk on adoption for children who are orphans. Child orphans. We're also making use of temporary care for the children, which allows us to place them temporarily in Russian families. We're sending humanitarian assistance to children in Donbass. With regard to child refugees, we're organizing a process to set children up in school and making use of all the different options: conventional school, homeschooling, inclusive schooling, and also distance learning. Mr. President, the Russian armed forces are making every effort to protect children during the course of the special military operation in Ukraine. We roundly condemn violations of international humanitarian law, especially those carried out against children. We think unacceptable both premeditated attacks on children and other people who benefit from protection, as well as the indiscriminate or extreme use of force and the use of schools for military purposes. Today, once again, we've heard from a number of colleagues accusations towards Russian military saying that they have attacked children, including sexually. This, as were comments made by my British colleague, but not only. These accusations are absurd. But we would therefore like to refer to the primary sources here. In an interview with the television company Belsat, the presidential commissioner in Ukraine on the rights of the child, Daria Gerasimchuk, said the following: "The Prosecutor General of Ukraine doesn't have any confirmed facts. Many buildings, educational facilities in towns where active military activity is going on are being used by Ukrainian military as base points, as a result of which they have been significantly damaged. We also have the firm impression that norms of international humanitarian law exist for anybody, but not for Kiev. Schools, kindergartens, and other children's educational facilities are being seized by the Ukrainian armed authorities, and that's not an exception but a rule. This inhumane method of carrying out military activities, jeopardizing the lives of children, depriving them of their right to education, and destroying the educational infrastructure of Ukraine. Deliberate destruction of civilian objects is also the calling card of Kiev, and this is not Russian propaganda, as some might like to believe. On the 6th of May, we held an informal Security Council meeting in the Aria Formula, where we heard not only independent foreign journalists, but also simple inhabitants of the two republics. They, in emotional terms, told us how the pseudo-heroic Azov battalion, before their very eyes, shot dead civilians, including in buses with children who were trying to evacuate from the zone of military activity. How these young men drove people out of their flats, and also injured people were driven from hospitals. How they occupied children's kindergartens and schools, and how they organized their camps there, and also warehouses for weapons and munitions. There's much evidence for this, and we have documented it very closely. The Kievan authorities have also thrown a shadow on the other documents of soft law in education. We're talking about the Safe Schools Declaration. This is a document that is not legally binding, but our Western colleagues very much like to talk about the importance of it. And what do we see? Ukraine, which it seemed to publicly take on the commitments under this document, is completely ignoring it. In the same way, the activities of Ukraine are not only forming a risk for children who are being used by the Ukrainian armed forces as a living shield, but they're also devaluing the document itself. Incidentally, in their readiness to see these schools as targets, Ukraine is showing that it does that, not only in the Donbass. For example, yesterday, a school in the village of Solokha was bombarded. That's in the Belgorod region on the territory of the Russian Federation. We'd also like to draw your attention to another important fact. The Ukrainian nationalists, in particular fighters from the infamous Azov regiment, have been recruiting children into the Ukrainian armed authorities for many years and have also been educating them to hate everything that's Russian. In a number of regions in Ukraine to this end, they have set up children's camps where children from 7 to 18 years old are hosted. One of these camps was the Pilgrim camp in Mariupol, where children were turned into future fighters. Another similar establishment was the Organization for Youth in Ukraine, the Centuria organization. The basis of its ideology was radical Ukrainian nationalism. Reports on the training of child soldiers have appeared repeatedly, including on Western television, even before the beginning of the special military operation by Russia in Ukraine. In 2018, journalists from Associated Press in Ukraine saw how young people from the Azovets young people's camp were taught to, and I quote, destroy subhumans, end quote. Journalists from the United States had culture shock. Mr. President, our discussion today concerns education. I'd therefore like to talk about the quality of education in Ukraine, which the authorities in Kiev have continually tried to tailor to their ideology. We have analysed more than 300 school textbooks and manuals from Ukraine, and this has shown that there is targeted work going on to create a chain that distorts history and historic truth. I'm not even talking about the fact that children are presented with fascist collaborationists as heroes. I'm talking about the fact that in modern Ukrainian education, the aim is to orient Ukrainian young people against Russia from the earliest ages, and they've begun to sculpt us as an enemy for a long time now. And in the years since the Maidan, the education system has been used by the Ukrainian regime, and they have put out materials for students, teaching them how to use firearms against separatists and occupiers. The total Ukrainization of education and the rewriting of the joint pages of history of the Russian and Ukrainian nations is what's being done by the Ministry of Education and Science in Ukraine. In 2016, this authority, and I quote, taking into account the historic events of recent years, end quote, established 25 educational programs. The broadest step change was on programs on history and geography. I even brought with me a geography textbook for Year 8 students that's edited by Masliak and Capirulina. If you believe it, then the forefathers of the French, the Spaniards and the Portuguese, the Turks and even Jews came from Ukraine. Which I turned to my French colleague, Nicola, did you know that you in fact are Ukrainian? Well, if you don't believe me, then just read this textbook. I brought it with me. I took this from the textbook. There's an iron logic here. Since the French were from the Gauls, then they came from Galiciana, which is now in Ukraine. And do you know that, according to the authors of the textbook, Ukrainians and Poles have Slavic roots, but Russians have Finno-Ugric roots? And also, Belarusians are not considered Slavs, they are considered Balts. In the book, The History of Ukraine for Year 8 students, edited by Lyach and Terminova, it says that the Ukrainian people has existed for 140,000 years. In the book, a history book for Year 9 students, edited by Turchenko and Morocco, it says that by the end of the 18th century, Ukrainians were one of the largest nations in Europe. Here we should mention that Galichanets, the author of the book The Ukrainian Nation, is absolutely convinced and I quote, that the population of Western Europe entered the first millennium of the Common Era known as Ukrainians. And this is given that nobody called the inhabitants of the territory of modern Ukraine Ukrainians. Even in the work of Taras Shevchenko, the esteemed poet from Ukraine who lived there in the middle of the 19th century, the term Ukraine is entirely absent. The inhabitants of those lands were called Ruthenians, Russians, or in extreme cases, Little Russians. But I'm not going to get into this subject that is so unpleasant for my Ukrainian colleagues. There are a range of different absurd examples from Ukrainian school curricula and textbooks. There is, for example, a Ukrainian historian, Valery Bebik, and he's not the only one. For example, he asserts that Constantinople was a colony of Kherson, which is now of Chersones rather, which is now Sevastopol, and that the forefathers of the Scythians were Heracles, an inhabitant of Crimea, whose roots are to be found on the island of Khortytsa in the Dnieper. The city Menapa near Chernigov, it turns out, was named after the first Egyptian pharaoh Menes, and the Ukrainian state has existed for more than 7,500 years. The famous Mongol commander of the 12th and 13th centuries, according to Mr. Bebik, Genghis Khan, was in fact called Bogdan. If you don't believe me, then the author advises you to read The Secret History of the Mongols, where Genghis Khan is called Bogda Khan. And from this it's clear that he was not a Mongol at all, but was a real Ukrainian. All the more so given that he fought, as is seen under the Ukrainian trident and yellow and blue banners. And of course, his main conclusion is that Ukraine was the cradle of global civilization, and even Jesus Christ, in Mr. Bebik's terms, as he said in one of his interviews, could be from Galicia. This is no joke. I'm quoting his interview here. Some of you might ask why I'm spending so much time on this person. Of course, there are many crazy people in our countries who promote marginal and very controversial historic theories. Of course, there are many of them, and we have them in Russia as well. But there is one nuance here, and that's that Valery Bebuk is not any ordinary madman, but a very distinguished madman. And among these mad pseudo-historians. In 2015, when Poroshenko declared that the country needed to found a special Ministry of Information Policy, and in essence a Ministry of Truth, a Ministry of New Truth, however you want to call it, then the temporary head of the community board in that organisation was indeed Valery Bebik, who in essence became the main historian of Ukraine. Furthermore, this person repeatedly was nominated for the National Ukrainian Prize named after Taras Shevchenko, a state award for a significant contribution to the development of culture and art. The decision to award it is taken personally by the president for works, and I quote, which represent the highest spiritual achievement of the Ukrainian people, which increase historic memory and the identity of the nation, end quote. So he wasn't just some kind of misfit, but was in essence the father of the modern Ukrainian historiography. Mr. President, we hope that ultimately the Ukrainian children will finally be able to continue their education under a normal curriculum and won't be fed this drivel that the Ukrainian authorities are forcing on them at the moment. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci.
Thank you. I thank Ms. Joyce Msuya and Mr. Omar Abdi for their respective briefings, and I would like to thank France and Mexico for the initiative to hold this briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, focused on the situation experienced by children in the context of the war. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is worsening as the fighting goes on. To date, almost 14 million people have been forced into displacement since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Half of the refugees or displaced persons are children. Whether these displacements are towards other cities in Ukraine, neighboring countries, or further afield, they remain a source of trauma and distress. Women and children, who represent the greatest number of civilians fleeing war zones, are also paying the highest price of the consequences of the war. Of those children who have left Ukraine since the 24th of February, some are unaccompanied minors. This increases their risk of falling prey to all sorts of abuse, trafficking, or exploitation. These fragilities are further exacerbated by the daily difficulties resulting from water shortages, having difficulty accessing healthcare and energy. UNHCR figures on children killed or wounded during the fighting, particularly in the east and west of Ukraine, are chilling. Once again, we appeal to the belligerents to respect international humanitarian law. Civilians, and in particular children, but also humanitarian personnel, must never be targeted. We also ask the parties to facilitate the unhindered deployment of humanitarian aid wherever there are people in need, without discrimination. Mr. President, the situation of children calls for the greatest attention of the international community in order to mitigate the consequences of war on their daily lives, particularly with regard to their schooling. It's important that we enable children to continue their studies. We're grateful to UNICEF for the inventiveness that it has demonstrated to continue to provide schooling to child victims of war in host countries by, for instance, establishing temporary classes or organizing learning, educational or recreational activities. I would also like to specifically congratulate all of those countries who have welcomed refugees and have made arrangements to provide urgent schooling to refugee children from Ukraine. We hail the work of UNICEF that is shouldering its responsibilities towards the children in Ukraine by addressing families and children specifically to provide for their hygiene needs, their primary or specialist health needs, including psychosocial health and mental health care, while also ensuring their safety. We're also grateful to all UN specialized agencies on the ground. We encourage them to work with UNICEF to limit the trauma for child victims of war. We've taken note of the statistics in the latest UNHCR report on the children registered in dedicated centres and the establishment of help desks to provide information about host families and operational mechanisms that continue to be rolled out in order to strengthen protection for families and children. It's crucial to limit as much as possible the chance for mafia networks to benefit from the chaotic situation of these children. Mr. President, alongside the work on the ground, which seeks to respond to critical humanitarian emergencies, discussions must continue in parallel in order to find a political solution to the situation, with the aim of bringing an end to the war. This is the greatest step that can be made to help these children for whom we are meeting today. A way out can only be found by dialogue. That's why my country appeals once again to the parties to harness all opportunities to resume dialogue. We call for resolute commitment for a return to peace and security in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the briefers from OCHA and UNICEF for their insights on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, but particularly on the impact of the conflict on children and education. We have carefully noted the points made by them. Children constitute a third of humanity, the most important third, as they are our future. They are also the most vulnerable to suffering, particularly in situations of armed conflict, and therefore need additional protection and care. The conflict in Ukraine is no doubt severely impacting the 7.5 million children across Ukraine. While the protection of the rights of the child, including their access to education, is the primary responsibility of national government, the international community has the obligation to do its utmost to provide succor to children affected by this conflict. India is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and appreciative of the ongoing efforts including that of UNICEF, to alleviate the suffering of the children. We also support UNICEF efforts to scale up its operations. The conflict has also forced more than 5 million people to take shelter in the neighboring countries, and another 7.1 million are displaced within Ukraine. Out of these, women and children constitute the majority. We commend the efforts by the neighboring countries of Ukraine who have welcomed refugees from Ukraine, and especially for treating women and children with compassion and dignity. As a country which has welcomed refugees over centuries, India knows the importance and value of treating them equally and with dignity and catering to their needs and requirements. The impact of situation on education of children has also been severe. It has further aggravated the pandemic-related challenges that children were already facing. There are reports that more than 900 education facilities and schools have either been damaged or destroyed in Ukraine. The efforts of the government of Ukraine to protect schools and other learning spaces, students and children, teachers, to ensure uninterrupted education for children needs unequivocal support of the international community. Let us not forget the situation has also affected foreign students, including those from India. India facilitated safe return of 22,500 Indian nationals, most of them students studying in various universities in Ukraine. We are exploring options to minimize the impact of our students' education. We appreciate the relaxations made by the government of Ukraine for this academic year in respect of medical students. India has been sending humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors, which include medicines and other essential relief material. Just last week, a further tranche of aid, including essential medicines and medical equipment, were handed over to the Ukrainian side. We support calls for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies, including through establishment of humanitarian corridors. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements. The food security challenges emanating from the conflict requires us to respond by going beyond constraints that bind us presently. Energy security is equally a serious concern and needs to be addressed through cooperative efforts. We acknowledge the efforts made by the Secretary General, particularly the findings of Global Crisis Response Group Task Team. While responding positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements is an obligation and responsibility of the international community, it is in our collective interest to work constructively both within the United Nations and outside towards seeking an early solution to the conflict. Since the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, India has stood for peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of innocent lives, especially those of women and children. Allow me to reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance once again. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, that is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. In conclusion, Mr. President, we continue to reiterate that the global order is anchored in international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. Thank you, Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Deputy Executive Director Abdi, for your very insightful briefings, which provide the Council and the watching global community an opportunity to hear of the immense suffering that has resulted from this unnecessary and brutal war, especially the suffering Russia is inflicting on children in Ukraine. Your briefings underscore what all of us who do not live in Russia, have seen on our screens and in the media for the last 2.5 months. Children in Ukraine have been displaced, hurt, orphaned, or killed. Of the nearly 14 million people forced to flee their homes since the conflict escalated, approximately half are innocent children. Children who deserve a chance to live, grow, and thrive, but instead are struggling every day to survive in horrific circumstances. The danger to children is only increasing. Growing numbers of hospitals and schools have been destroyed, as we're hearing, In the first 5 weeks since the February 24th invasion, an average of 22 schools were struck every day. Since this war began, there has been more than 200 attacks on healthcare facilities and schools. We heard news this past weekend, as other members have mentioned, of a bomb hitting a school in the eastern Ukrainian town of Bilohorivka. It killed as many as 60 people, including many children. And reliable reports indicate that when first responders arrived at the school to assist victims of the bombing, Russia's forces opened fire on them. We've all seen devastating and gruesome images of mass graves. There are reports of individuals executed en masse, bodies marked with unequivocal signs of torture, and now we are hearing more and more horrific accounts of sexual violence against women and girls, as well as boys and LGBTQ persons. The United States is particularly concerned about the situation in Kherson, where Russian forces have reportedly removed local officials and installed an illegitimate pro-Russian puppet administration. In recent days, these illegitimate proxies have increasingly indicated an intention to petition Russia to annex Kherson. Russia is clearly seeking to assimilate these regions into its orbit, and for the children of Kherson, this would have grave consequences. For example, schools would be forced to adopt the Russian curriculum with the goal of trying to erase all signs of Ukrainian adult identity or Ukrainian culture. In addition to fearing every waking day for their lives and safety, displacement poses particular risks for children. They become increasingly vulnerable to human trafficking and other forms of exploitation and abuse. This is even more acute for those children who are unaccompanied or have been separated from their parents or caregivers. Ukrainians have reportedly been deported to Russia and processed through so-called filtration camps, many of them children. Meanwhile, Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, has touted efforts to fast-track the adoption of children from Ukraine within Russia. Children are being exposed to extreme violence, fear, and anxiety. This can have major psychological effects on children that will impact for generations. Unless appropriate support is provided, the trauma associated with these experiences can have serious and enduring negative consequences on their cognitive development for years to come. Many on this council have just now called for diplomacy to resolve this crisis. We agree that diplomacy and dialogue are essential to resolve this crisis, and Russia should show its commitment to pursuing a peaceful resolution by silencing the guns and withdrawing its forces from Ukraine. We call again on Russia to end its war on Ukraine and to abide by its obligations under international humanitarian law, including those regarding taking feasible precautions to avoid and to minimize harm to civilians, including children. Additionally, all parties to the conflict should urgently facilitate safe and unhindered access for medical and humanitarian workers and supplies in order to ensure the provision of necessary humanitarian assistance and allow safe passage for those seeking to flee, including children. We join others in calling on the UN Secretary General and the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict to add Ukraine as a situation of concern in the upcoming annual report on children in armed conflict. Given the scale and nature of reported violations and abuses committed by Russia against children in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and 2021, and the evidence of alarming increases in violations and abuses by Russia across Ukraine since February 2022, the situation warrants a place in the report. The international community has an obligation to protect children, as almost all of us around the table have said. Children, who are the most vulnerable among us. Member states should work collectively to ensure that innocent children, regardless of the borders in which they reside, can live without imminent fear of death, shelling, and lifelong trauma. Let us do our part. Let us not forget the children of Ukraine. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I would like to again draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in Council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I will now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, I also recognize the representatives of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Perhaps as defendants in a future trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, they should avail of this session as pre-trial hearings. First of all, I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya and UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Omar Abdi for their briefings. Dear colleagues, admiration and pain, the sentiments of all those who are now watching Azovstal, Mariupol. Courageous defenders hold their positions under full blockade without any replenishments. Another day, another week, another month. Every day and night, the Russian occupiers try to break the resistance of the Ukrainians in Azovstal. Every day and night, they drop heavy aerial bombs. They shell the facilities with heavy artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. Assault groups of the Russian infantry are attacking non-stop. The defenders of Mariupol have already done the impossible. They stopped the overwhelming Russian troops for more than 3 months. Their contribution to the disruption of the Russian blitzkrieg plans can't be overestimated. Mariupol has paid a heavy price for this. The death toll among its residents over these months, about 20,000, is double the amount cost during the Second World War by German Nazis, who killed 10,000. That is the reason for the attackers to show no restraint in their attempts to finally crush the resistance. That is the reason why we are extremely concerned about the destiny of the defenders of Azovstal should they fall into the hands of the Russian troops. Even during the evacuation of civilians from Azovstal on the 7th of May, the Russian forces continued to shell the Ukrainian soldiers. As a result, 3 Ukrainian servicemen were killed and 6 were wounded in violation of all agreed arrangements. Many in Azovstal have been heavily wounded and they have no access to the medical treatment they urgently need. Therefore, we consider that the evacuation operation should be continued. We call on the Security Council and the Secretary General to invest further efforts to ensure the evacuation of the sick and wounded from the Azovstal area in accordance with international humanitarian law. They have to be brought to safe places where their right to life will be guaranteed. Russian captivity is not such a place for the servicemen from Azovstal. We are also alarmed that the repressive Russian practice of using filtration camps for Ukrainians fleeing dangerous areas is being consolidated further. Given the inhumane conditions and ill treatment, the word filtration can only be considered as euphemism for concentration. It is outrageous that Russia has applied these filtration practices to civilians who were evacuated from Azovstal under the facilitation of the United Nations and the ICRC. Some of them were illegally detained. For instance, during the evacuation on May 9, ironically on Mother's Day, the Russian occupiers separated a 4-year-old girl, Alice, from her mother. a medical worker. Only the little child was allowed to leave the occupied territory, while her mother was reported to be detained in a filtration camp. These actions by the Russian forces constitute a gross violation of child's right to life and security, guaranteed by the Hague and Geneva Conventions on the UN Convention and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We demand Russia immediately and unconditionally release the child's mother and ensure she is reunited with her daughter. We call on UNICEF to use all possible means to protect the rights of this child and other children who were separated from their parents by the Russians. Mr. President, the statement by the President of the Security Council on May 6 serves as another example. Immediately after the Russian Federation joined the members of the Security Council in recalling the obligation of all member states to settle their disputes by peaceful means, it fired rockets on Ukraine's Odessa and Mykolaiv, Kharkiv and Zaporizhia regions. Russia continues its missile terror on a daily basis, targeting mostly civilian infrastructure. Since the 24th of February, Russia has fired more than 2,100 missiles on Ukrainian cities and villages. Women and children throughout Ukraine remain the most vulnerable groups under the conditions of the missile terror of Russia. Dear colleagues, at least 226 children have been killed and 417 wounded by the Russian troops in Ukraine. There is no doubt that the actual data is much higher, as the occupied territory remains a no-go zone for any credible international mechanisms. Every day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine brings us new tragedies and new crimes committed by Russians. One of the most recent cases happened in the village of Bilohorivka, the Lugansk region, on the 7th of May. Following a Russian airstrike on a local school, the only building with a shelter, only 30 civilians out of 90 were rescued. The school, once full of joyful children, was turned by Russian pilot into another mass grave. Last night, Russia carried out an airstrike on Novhorod-Siversky, destroying another school. As of today, about 130 educational institutions have been entirely destroyed and more than 1,500 have been damaged. I reiterate that schools must never be attacked or used for military purposes. Targeting civilians and civilian objects, including schools, is a violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, in violation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Russia continues its kidnapping of Ukrainian children. After forcible transfer to Russia, they are illegally adopted by Russian citizens without observing any of the mandatory procedures envisaged by the legislation of Ukraine. According to official Russian sources, on May 7th, more than 1 million Ukrainians have been transferred to Russia, including 200,000 children. 2,000 of them are orphans or those deprived of paternal care. The children's living conditions and their state of health remain unknown. We call on UNICEF, UNHCR, and ICRC to demand from Russia immediate and unhindered access to those children, as well as to all persons who have been transferred from conflict-affected areas of Ukraine to Russia or Ukrainian territories under temporary Russian control. We also call on the Secretary General to use all the mechanisms established by the Council to monitor and report on violations against children in conflict. Mr. President, according to WHO, at least 3,000 people have died in Ukraine during the period of the invasion due to the lack of access to treatment of chronic diseases. The Health Ministry of Ukraine reported that as of today, Russian troops have destroyed or damaged about 400 healthcare facilities. Under the circumstances of war, the treatment of cancer patients have been completely stopped in Ukraine. There are serious problems with access to insulin and antibiotics. The situation with access to medical services in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine in the east and south can only be described as a disaster. There is a storage of the most basic drugs. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities estimates that Russia's military attacks against Ukraine are putting the lives of 2.7 million people with disabilities at risk. Distinguished colleagues, we welcome the launch of the Commission of Inquiry to investigate the atrocities related to Russia's war against Ukraine. The resolution adopted today in Geneva mandates the Commission to conduct a special investigation into war crimes committed by Russian invaders in areas of Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions. The list includes arbitrary executions of more than 1,000 civilians, widespread instances of sexual violence, torture, and other violations. Ukraine, together with up to 50 partner countries, will ensure accountability for all perpetrators. Mr. President, it is symbolic that one of the Russian rockets launched on May 7th destroyed the Museum of Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda. In his doctrine, he promoted humanistic ideas. Indeed, the current Russia is too far from humanism. The recent saber-rattling celebration of the 9th of May served as another illustration. The entire world commemorates on the 8th of May the memory of victims and those who stopped the Nazism 77 years ago under the motto, "Never again." Russia has made the day of the 9th of May a cornerstone of its ideology, which is a combination of a propaganda war, hatred towards neighbors, militarization, and utmost disregard for agreed rules, norms, and values. We are grateful to all member states that co-sponsored the joint statement on the occasion of the 77th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe, and thus demonstrated their resolute stance towards cynical attempts to appropriate and exploit the memory of the victory over Nazism and to use it for justifying this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Listening to Putin nowadays, one can hardly believe he is the same person who once wrote in his op-ed for the New York Times that, I quote, "The law is still the law, and we must follow it whether we like it or not," wrote Putin 9 years ago. He also wrote, I quote, "Under current international law, force is permitted only in self-defense or by the decision of the Security Council. Anything," Putin wrote, "anything else is unacceptable under the UN Charter and would constitute an act of aggression," end of quote. Edition for September 11, 2013, under the title, "A Plea for Caution from Russia." 9 years ago, Russian diplomatic vocabulary still contained the word caution. And according to Putin's op-ed, Russia's current actions against Ukraine should be considered as act of aggression. Because nobody attacked Russia, because no single decision has been adopted by the Security Council to sanction Russian actions in Ukraine. If it was not so tragic, it could have been funnier and much deeper fake than deep fake Putin videos on Trevor Noah's Daily Show. In fact, they are much closer to reality than Putin's envoy speaking here. Not long after Putin's hypercritical op-ed about supremacy of international law. In March 2014, the late Putin's envoy Churkin at least made an effort to keep up appearances in this council, trying to find at least some justification to Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today's standards of Russian diplomacy have gone through the floor, and all masks off. Russia is the only beneficiary of the Council's inactions on the issue of its war against Ukraine. At the same time, I doubt that it is the interest of 14 Security Council members to tolerate the Russian strategy of undermining the Council's credibility. I urge the Security Council to demonstrate resoluteness in safeguarding this organ and its mandate from the destructive Russian practices. And I do not apologize that I was not careful listening to the drivel by the Russian ambassador, but I need to break the news to the Russian delegation. Scientific evidence still suggests that all modern humans are descendant from African population of Homo sapiens that spread out of Africa about 60,000 years ago, and I'm proud to be one of them. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am speaking on behalf of the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. I thank the briefers for their updates on the alarming humanitarian situation in Ukraine and the daily work by UNICEF and OCHA to help those affected by the brutal Russian military aggression. We cannot consider this dire situation without making clear who, by choice, started this war and who can end it: the Russian Federation, which must put an end to its aggression and the suffering of children in Ukraine. The Russian aggression has been accompanied by killing, torture, and terror aimed at civilians, while demonizing and dehumanizing them in the Russian war propaganda. Make no mistake, children have been and continue to be targets for Russia. За детей, for children, written on the side of a Russian missile that struck the Kramatorsk train station, was a cynical but revealing expression of this. Children born in shelters during bombings, living through days of air raids and destruction, stepping on trains, leaving their homes and families behind. The UN has recorded 238 children killed and over 300 injured in Ukraine since 24th of February, as it admits a clear underestimate. Hundreds of schools and educational institutions destroyed and damaged according to the UN, most recently in Bilohorivka, resulting in the death of over 60 people after a Russian bomb flattened the school. Children suffering in besieged cities such as Mariupol without access to humanitarian assistance. In less than 3 months, 14 million people, including 2/3 of Ukraine's children, have been forced to leave their homes. Ukraine's Human Rights Commissioner asserts that more than 121,000 children have been forcibly deported to Russia. The forced deportations, along with the Russian steps towards legislative changes to accelerate the adoption of children from Ukraine, in violation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, need to be monitored by the UN and other relevant organizations. The Russian actions represent violations of international law amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as grave violations against children in conflict. This includes killing and maiming, attacks against schools and hospitals, and sexual violence. Russia's crimes are recorded and it will be held accountable. We underline and support the role of the ICC and the UN Commission of Inquiry and the UN monitoring mission in this work. We call for the full implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1612, as well as further resolutions on children and armed conflict, including Resolution 2601 on the protection of education. We recall that Russia, a permanent member of this Council, has endorsed and has to comply with these. We underline the importance of the recording, monitoring, and reporting on violations against children in Ukraine to the Security Council, including the Secretary General's Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict. We value the tireless work by UNICEF, other UN agencies, and civil society in Ukraine and beyond to protect children. We welcome the work of the UN and ICRC in coordinating the efforts to ensure the safe passage of civilians, including children, from Mariupol. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will continue to support the work of these organizations and to provide financial and in-kind humanitarian assistance to Ukraine in the total amount of more than 46 million euros. We have welcomed those fleeing the war in Ukraine and offered them access to our education and health systems, as well as online learning opportunities and mental health support for children in Ukraine and those outside. Mr. President, this Council has stood strong in calling for the protection of children in conflict. It needs to be strong and absolutely clear in calling on Russia to put an end to its aggression and to the horrors it has brought to children in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, Excellencies, I would like to thank the United States for organizing this important and timely briefing and for shedding light on the situation of children in Ukraine in the aftermath of Russia's aggression. I would also like to thank the excellent briefers, Ms. Joyce Msuya and Mr. Omar Abdi, for their insights and, more importantly, all their work in helping the youngest victims of Russian aggression. Mr. Chair, since the outbreak of war, more than 3.3 million people, as of today, mostly women and children, have crossed from Ukraine into Poland to seek refuge. Poland, both as a state and as a society, makes every effort to meet their needs. Ensuring that children continue their education is one of our top priorities. Keeping in mind that the interruption of the educational process, even for a short period of time, has long-lasting effects and can prevent students from returning to learning, we are determined to ensure that each of those affected by war can continue their education. Depending on parents' preferences, we offer support by enrolling children in Polish schools or providing them with equipment necessary for distance learning within the Ukrainian educational system. For those who want to continue their education in Polish schools, we organize preparatory classes, which will help them to find their way in the Polish educational system and to overcome the language barrier. Currently, there are almost 200,000 refugee children from Ukraine in Polish schools. About 20% of them attend preparatory classes and 80% attend regular classes together with Polish children. The Ministry of Education has created an online platform where various educational tools are available for free. In addition, the Ministry organizes special language courses for teachers from Ukraine who have come to Poland. Courses are also organized for Polish teachers, including in Ukrainian language, to make it easier for them to communicate with children coming from Ukraine and better respond to their educational needs. Additionally, I would like to present a project of the Polish Center for International Aid in coordination with CARE. As part of Cash for Work program, Ukrainian teachers find employment in Polish schools and kindergartens as assistants of refugee children. We also pay particular attention to the needs of children with disabilities. Children with special education needs, as well as their parents, can benefit from psychological and pedagogical assistance in Polish kindergartens and schools. Students who are pursuing higher education in Ukraine before the outbreak of war can also continue their studies at Polish universities. Moreover, we launched several programs offering institutional and financial support for academics from Ukraine to enable them to continue their research projects. Excellencies, schools provide children with education, but they play a much bigger role in their lives. In times of war, classrooms can and should provide children with a sense of stability and act as a safe space to learn and to process the trauma. However, across Ukraine, hundreds of schools have been destroyed in Russian shelling and airstrikes. Many classrooms are simply unusable after being damaged or destroyed. Even after the war is over, it will still take a long time to rebuild the schools and other educational facilities. Attacks on civilian areas, including civilian infrastructure, are endangering children's lives and their futures. Poland condemns, in the strongest possible terms, attacks against civilians and civilian objects, such as schools, hospitals, and orphanages. All perpetrators of violations of international law, especially humanitarian international law and human rights, must be held accountable. Mr. Chair, over 2,000 patients from Ukraine are hospitalized in Poland. Nearly half of them are children. A pediatric hub was established in the city of Lublin, from where young patients are being transferred to institutions all over the country and abroad. It has to be stressed that Ukrainian children, just like all children all around the world, were already dealing with mental health challenges from being isolated during almost 2 years of the pandemic. Now, having left the comforts of home, not to mention their family and friends who stayed in Ukraine to fight, any move towards pre-pandemic normalcy has been cruelly interrupted. Poland offers psychiatric, psychological, and other mental health social services to help Ukrainian refugees. However, the needs are growing every day. Mr. President, Poland is doing the best we can to help Ukrainian children in those troubled and terrifying times, offering them safety of our homes in Poland, among our families, and a kind of normal life with its duties and joys. We hope that we are able to save at least part of their dreams and their childhood. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for her statement. And I will now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start by thanking today's briefers, Assistant Secretary General Suya and Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Abdi, for their presentations, which once again shed light on devastating impacts of the Russian war in Ukraine, this time specifically on the issue of children and their right to education. We appreciate the updates that you have shared with us, and we were listening carefully, and we will certainly factor all the additional information in our further work and activities. As the UNICEF's Regional Advisor on Child Protection for Europe and Central Asia said earlier on the 6th of May in a press briefing, hospitals, including nurseries and schools, continue to be impacted by strikes, unfortunately. Slovakia therefore categorically condemns these attacks, including the most recent one in Bilohorivka in the Luhansk region. This attack, together with all the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, constitute a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and must be thoroughly investigated, and justice must be served. We also concur with the Secretary General that this attack is yet another reminder that in a war, civilians pay the highest price, and I add children in particular. We have been following these developments very carefully also in our current capacity as Vice President of the Executive Board of UNICEF and as a neighboring and directly affected country. According to the most recent reports, including update from the OHCHR monitoring mission in Ukraine as of the 11th of May, more than 230 children have already lost their lives, and more than 340 children have been injured. Approximately 2/3 of Ukrainian children have been forced to flee their homes, and all of them have been negatively affected. This is a terrible and devastating impact on the future